Welcome to the Layman Seminary. Today, I'm preparing for my presentation this morning, I believe it is, on Awake Not Woke that I'm going to be doing for a pastor's group led by Dr. Dean. And since my audience is pastors, teachers, things like that, um, I went back in and I looked at how other people had gave their book presentations to kind of modify their style. This is the third video in the series, what I call teaching my wife or introducing my wife to critical theory, sociology, or whatever. And I titled it that way because as I'm talking about this content, I wanted to be viewed in light of that. Because my undergraduate's in sociology, and now I'm not doing a whole sociological review analysis or whatever. I'm coming at it from I'm a Christian who's been asked to give a reaction to this book, and y'all have seen those other two videos. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start going through this. This will help me get an idea about my timing and what I need to change and go from there. So the author of this book, Awake Not Woke, that's subtitled A Christian Response to the Code of Progressive Ideology. Her name is Noelle Marion. She's Catholic. You could find her all over YouTube, different interviews and stuff. Ave Maria Radio, Renewal Ministries, and after I read the book, I did listen to some of those to see how she talked about her own book. And so that's interesting there. She's also a fellow. This is from her blog page, our website. Neil Marion is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where she co-directs the Theology at Home project. She's the editor for Theology at Home, co-author of the Theology at Home book series, and the author of Wake Not Woke, a Christian response to the cult of progressive ideology. She studied philosophy and theater at Westmount College in California and got her MA in philosophy at Franciscan University at Steubenville. Noelle and her husband live in Southern California with their 6 children. Okay. So that is where we're at as far as the author and everything. Now, the structure, I've already mentioned something about the author. I'm going to give my impression of the book. I might as well just do that now. So my impression of the book is, as it first started out, I was like, okay, you're given lots of examples, lots of stuff from current events that could easily be used in sermon illustrations or to orient somebody to the topic and everything. There wasn't just this but I always had the feeling, and a lot of times whenever I hear the discussion of this Awake Not Woke, I'm always frustrated because whenever I'm hearing people talk about this, I'm like, this is not anything new, so as I was reading the first paragraph and I'm seeing it, I'm like, man, okay, this is good for current events and to get illustrations and sermons and stuff, but let's really get to the philosophy of things. And it was really, I think it was in chapter 2 or maybe 3 where that really started kicking off. So my impression was, okay, this could be used for illustrations. But overall, whenever I'm reading the book, I'm like, okay, there's ideas and concepts that are mentioned that you would have to Google to learn about. But she does expose you to some main trends behind some of these things and some of the philosophy behind it. And so I was like, okay, this is not as difficult as some of the other books the other guys in the group have had to read. And so that was a relief, So there was no foreword for this book or a preface that I see in the Kindle edition. But there was an introduction. And like I was saying, it basically gives the illustration. It starts with Wellesley College talking about the commencement ceremony there, discussed from the New York Times article where they're singing American the Beautiful. And whenever they get to the part, Crown Thy Good with Brotherhood, everyone traditionally has hollered out sisterhood in this particular area. Well, now everyone hollers out all kinds of things, because this is basically an illustration to show that people are just using words to refine whatever they want, and then it just becomes, words become meaningless. And so a beautiful song where everybody's hollering out all these different things instead in place of brotherhood means nothing. You know, it's chaos, the way the article is mentioned. And so that's kind of like the illustration that sets off the entire book, that there's a breakdown in words to have the ability to have meaning. And so as I'm talking about this book, I think the strengths of it is the illustration factor. A lot of these things that are mentioned in here could be used for pastors or teachers to integrate into their sermons, you know, as an illustration here to support a point there. Or also it could be used to orient people within. I wouldn't teach it by itself like a class or whatever. I've known people that have done that with books similar to this, but I think it could be integrated into sermons or teachings and things like that. I think the weakness of the book is well, in addition to its Catholic framework and its Catholic solution, I think that its weakness is that there's some terms in here, there's people in here that you kind of do have to Google and stuff. You know, it could have been worse, like other books and stuff like that. So, but essentially what the purpose of the book is to name what's going on here. And once you can name it, you can do something about it. The book uses the Munchausen syndrome as basically to say to name what's poisonous. You know, it uses this Munchausen syndrome thing that that the movie The Sixth Sense in the 90s exposed a person to, where the mother looks like the compassionate one that you have sympathy for because she's feeding and nursing her child that's sick, but come to find out the mother has been poisoning the child all along in order to meet her need to be needed or whatever. Rapper Eminem claimed that his mother done this to him, medicines and stuff, at least in his song Cleaning Out His Closet. But basically this becomes an illustration, a metaphor for what the woke movement is doing. It's poisoning society, and at the same time playing the victim, playing the hero even to people, but in reality it's poison. And what's interesting is that in discussion, Noel says there's 3 responses that a person can have. You know, in the Sixth Sense movie, the mother needed to be stopped from doing what she was doing, which was poisoning her daughter. The daughter, the victim, the one that's been poisoned by this woke stuff, needs to be, you know, nursed back to health or whatever. And the father that was bringing the bowl or food or whatever needs to be awoken to the fact of the poison that he's bringing his daughter. And I'm not sure I got that analogy fully clear from the movie. I need to watch the ending of that as well again, maybe to help me with that. But those are the 3 things: stop, right? Awake somebody, and then the other thing is heal. Now, of course, if you're Catholic and you want to stop something, you go about it a certain way. But her solution in the book, as we'll talk about, is restoring personhood, which is a good idea. Restoring family, which is a good idea, of course. Restoring basically personal responsibility, virtue, sanctification, all good ideas. The sad thing is that she views it that this comes about through the Catholic Church, you know, that it's, you know, she talks about in one of her discussions about being at the grocery store, you know, at the checkout, and this whole idea of talking to people about your kids, because now what is the revolutionary thing is to have a lot of kids and all be of the same parent and all of, be of the family and whatever. And she talks about the practical idea of living out your faith, and her faith, of course, is the Catholics and stuff, from that perspective. But there's things that the Christian can adopt, in that practical stuff. I think there's other books that provide more practical things, but it does deal with the idea of the divine institutions, and how they're being attacked, and issues with that. So going into the structure of the book, well, here's the verse that she uses that to get this idea. Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give you light. So this is a passage about complacency, okay? To be awake but not woke. So it has 4 main divisions in it. The origins, dogma, and indoctrination, and restoration, okay? And I just added these other words here to clarify what we're talking about. The origins of the woke movement, the dogmas of the woke movement, the interdoctrination by the woke movement, and the restoration of God's order, which she believes is through the Catholics. Okay, so in the section underneath the origins of the woke movement, she starts in chapter 1, titling "Ye Shall Be as Gods." And she makes the comparison, between Adam and Eve in the garden and Satan's temptation that you be like gods, and basically says that this movement, this woke movement, is a self-deification movement where we get to name ourselves and identify ourselves and shape ourselves into what we believe we are, rather than looking to God to find out who we are. The chapter 2 talks about how Marxism, after the revolution didn't occur in all places, and in the way that they wanted, they basically had a school. I think it was the Institute of Social Studies or something like that in Germany, that was founded by a lot of neo-Marxists and neo-Freudians. And basically that school was trying to figure out what went wrong with the revolution. And so their studies and everything, their school of thought was eventually transplanted to America, and that's what chapter 3 talks about, through Columbus University. So like I said, I really enjoyed chapter 2 and 3 because we got into more philosophical. We talked about some of the people behind the movements, the ideology, the philosophy, all of those types of things, like Hegel and other things like that. Then we get into the dogma section, and it basically says that the woke movement has 3 dogmas: group over person. So rather than the self, finding support from one's faith and from the family and identity and those things like that, it's this idea of group or ideology over everything else, this group think. And you have to be politically correct, as somebody has said in their presentation, that this idea of being woke, it was what the term used to be called for, politically correct. Then you have this idea of will over reason. That what's happening is people are wanting to do whatever they desire to do, that they're in bondage, they're repressed, that they need, therefore, they need to exert their wills of power over other people rather than to use their rational thinking of things. And then power over authority. So this deals with conflict theory, which I'll talk about a little bit, and power conflicts, and just basically that everybody's out. The idea is that everybody's out there to wield power. And it talks about how the idea of authority should be built in to the concept of authenticity. In other words, you have integrity, and therefore that's why you have authority, rather than you got in power and you're wielding it by any means necessary. And then chapter 7 talks about the crowd and the victim, going into scripture, looking at how the crowds treated Jesus, and kind of putting and dealing with this idea, the voice of the crowd, the mob mentality that's out there, and then the victim mentality that's also out there, as opposed to Christ, who was, a sacrifice that willfully, laid his life down and those things like that. So then part 3 talks about the indoctrination by the woke movement. And it goes back to the sexual revolution and how that came about, going into details like that. And for, these sections right here, there's other books that we read in class. Like, I think it's When Harry Became Sally, and a couple other books that were mentioned in class, not class, but in this group, that probably could go in more detail than these areas, but this kind of still gives you ideas about this. And then you have this idea about thought and speech control in chapter 9. Basically, the two things that you have are the megaphone and the muzzle. They want to broadcast their message, get it out there, by these different groups and all of that. But then also they want to muzzle free speech when it doesn't benefit their ideology. Chapter 10 is talking about this education activism, this idea that when we talk about the Frankfurt School of Sociology being brought to the United States in Columbia's University, the idea is that they could be subversive through the march across the institutions. This idea that we would get these professors and teachers and we will infiltrate in that way, so that teachers could of these sociology, stuff like this, can have influence on other teachers and other students and things like that, so that it trickles down into the economy and brings about a cultural overthrow, or cultural Marxism, or cultural hegemony, different terms that are used for this. And then part 4 is where she's calling for this restoration to God's order, that the person is important, that the individual should be, the one that is valued rather than ideology over that, and it's sort of like, how consistent is this author with the things that they're saying? Because it's like, okay, you are a Catholic, so do you really value the person? I mean, sanctity of life issues in certain areas and things like that. But I mean, don't you put other things beyond the person? And don't you put other things beyond the family? And of course they do. In a sense, all Christians do, right? We believe in personal volition and responsibility, and we have a responsibility before God. And don't get me wrong, if someone was going to go to hell in my family because of what they believe, I'm not going to go to hell because of a family member. So I mean, yeah, faith rules in my relationship of family and person and things like that. And then she calls back to, she mentioned this in the beginning of the book, Augustine's view of the city of God, that whole idea there. And so going into chapter 1, the breakdown for that is just that there's an actual breakdown in how words have the ability to convey reality. It makes a comparison to talk about the Tower of Babel and how what's going on with this woke meaning is we have nothing to build on, and therefore that means that we're going to fail. Well, I don't really think it's a good example to use the Tower of Babel as if that's a goal that we should have. This is where eschatology comes in, because the Catholic Church thinks they have the solution now, and rather than seeing Christ come back and bring in the solution. I guess that's the way to put it. I'm premillennial, dispensational, pre-trib. And so I have a different eschatology as well as a different application of how this, and an audience that I'm talking to is going to as well. So then I've already talked about this metaphor, the Munchausen syndrome. And basically this idea of woke, in addition to the political correctness, is supposedly you recognizing that there are layers of pervasive oppression, different types of oppression all throughout society, where these marginalized groups are and everything like this. And then everything is a contest for power. It's all about a power grab. And she says that this is an attack on the Logos, which she relates to the person of Christ, of course, Jesus being the word, but also the word in the sense that the words that we use, the rational, the logic. When we talk about sociology, we're talking about the study of society as it relates to the logos, if you will, the system. So as we're going into this area, I'm like, well, I need to talk a little bit about sociology. And so these are some charts I made based on other charts that I saw. These are the three sociological perspectives, the main big sociological perspectives. Now, there's tons of other schools of thoughts and other things that could be lumped underneath these and mixing, matching, and merging that could go on. But these three, structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, is what we're talking about here. Structural functionalism basically says that social institutions maintain the social order and are healthy for a strong society. Conflict theory, right, which relates to Marxism, basically says social institutions benefit those in power due to inequalities, who controls the means of production and things like that. And then symbolic interactionism is that more important than these factors of what maintains society and what benefits others is our interactions, and our perceptions are actually what shapes reality. And so what you see is Comte, who's called the father of sociology, he taught that there was a move from the theological to the metaphysical to the positivistic idea of things. And positivism is this idea that science solves everything, rationalism solves everything. But and then as that's still around, at least in structural functionalism and conflict theory, I mean, there's still voices out there that relate to, you know, that type of mindset, even though there's, like with Kant, there's this a loss of a moral objectivity and things like that, and things are getting more subjective and relative. It's really when we see this move from modernity to postmodernism with symbolic interactionism, basically where we're making up reality. This is the emphasis and by which how people operate today. They'll dogmatically say there's no such thing as absolute truth. Yet they will protest and picket and act like all of these things really matter. But the reality is that if they were to be consistent to their own system, you could just say, well, those things are a social construct, and those groups are just doing what's according to social evolution and all of that. So I'm like, okay, I need to try to differentiate some of the language and terms. And I don't know how successful I was in this, but whenever I could put it like this, you could view all of these as three different forms of Marxist philosophy. So you got the classical Marxist theory, you got conflict theory, and then you got critical theory. So when I'm looking at classical Marxist theory, it's primarily about economic oppression, right? And it wanted to eradicate the inequalities. It was mainly about the struggle between the owners and the workers. And social class was usually the haves and the have-nots. And basically it argued that the laws that are in existence benefit the owners. Conflict theory says in addition to economic oppression, there's other types of oppression out there. But inequalities are useful so that people can get power and navigate the world and things like this, and that conflict is everywhere, and that there's a variety of different classes involved based on race, ethnicity, culture, sex, all of these factors involved. But this struggle of variety of power groups is really what comes to the forefront of this. And then you have critical theory. Well, critical theory focuses on the most marginalized and questions the dominant values of society or anybody else that's not according to how the lens that they're using or the argument that they're making. So they also believe that inequalities are useful, and they also believe that conflict is everywhere, and they believe that there's a variety of classes and that there's a variety of power groups. But the main issue is they're coming at perspective more from the symbolic interactionist standpoint of things. So their issues about perception and making up reality and identity seems to be at the forefront. So as we're talking about this, going into this issue about the road to Frankfurt, as I mentioned, Marx adopted the dialectic of Hegel, philosopher that basically taught that there's a thesis and an antithesis and a synthesis. So a thesis is your starting point of the status quo. Your antithesis is the reaction, the demand for change, and the synthesis is the progress to the new thesis. And if this keeps going on until you get to an ideal society. Well, that's what Marx said, but Hegel seems to indicate that it never stops, that it constantly continues. So Marx applied Hegel's philosophy inconsistently or ironically to economy and society, but it isn't logically built into the system. And so let's look at this real quick. And when we're talking about Marx a little bit, another contrast we could talk about is the Marxist then, which would be the classical, versus the cultural Marxism now. So the thesis at that time would be the private property, the ruling class at that time. The antithesis would be injustice because there's no path for a means to ownership. The synthesis is that a new rulership is put into place. And the philosophy, I would say, that's driving that was modernism. Okay, like I said, I've already recognized Kant and Rousseau and Hegel's influence and those types of things like that, but there were still people that really thought that the reality was really going on, but when we get into this culture Marxism, it's the thesis is the cultural dominance of the cis white male, the man, right, railing against the man, the system, in this way that is identified or exemplified or stereotyped by the cis white male. And then the antithesis of this is that you have the marginalized oppressed and the ones that perceive themselves as oppressed. This is where you get into microaggressions and all of this type of stuff that people claim. But the synthesis of this is where there's going to be a dictatorship of the oppressed. Basically, this idea that these marginalized groups are going to have voices, and I don't know if they're going to form a council. I don't know if they're going to eventually have an overruling body that influence everything. How is that going to look like in culture? I don't know, but these voices are getting stronger and stronger. In capitalistic wise, there's companies that are constantly, jumping on to the bandwagon of this stuff because it's appealing, because it feels like, okay, you're helping people, you're reaching out to the victim and all of this stuff, but actually this is the whole Munchausen thing coming about here. And so culture Marxism is operating from postmodernism, from the standpoint of symbolic interactionism more. So as I said, when the revolution didn't totally happen, the Institute of Social Research was founded by the Neo-Freudians and Neo-Marxists. But then in 1935, it came to the United States in the Columbia University. Now, when I heard that about the Columbia University, I thought of the movie Higher Learning that came out in the 90s. But actually, that occurred on Columbus University in the story. That book deals with a lot of racism on the campus and interaction and all of that. So I wondered, are they trying to allude to that? But as we're going through the book by Noelle, she talks about John Dewey and his influence into the education departments and stuff like that, as well as Herbert Marcuse, I think that's how you say his name, and his influence in the 60s with the students, and Angela Davis, I think there was a connection with that. And then she mentions Wilhelm Reich, the sexual revolution, and basically this idea that these ideas were influencing art in Hollywood at that time, so that art became like political statements and stuff. As I'm doing this, I'm kind of feeling like I've read the book, but a lot of the words that Noelle has said in certain areas about these things are on my mind. And I think that her voice, if you will, is coming a lot out in this presentation, which is kind of interesting. So I want to bring in the movies that affected me, some of my sociology stuff. That's why I made the charts. That's why I did all these different things, was try to put my voice back into it a little bit more. At least my takeaway from it. We'll see how that goes in the presentation. But so we get into here, and there, she talks about movies and how they're mainly about oppression. And then the problem with that is that eventually these movies about oppression that you constantly see, that are constantly headlining, they start distorting reality, because then you think oppression is everywhere, right? And this reminded me of Cultivation Theory, which was by Gerbner. Whenever, I think it was in 2016, when I was in anyway, in sociology, I went to Vegas, and we did a presentation on rape myths, and we used cultivation theory to talk about that. And basically, cultivation theory taught that it wasn't what you watched, it's how much you watched. And we were measuring like the differences on binge watching certain material. And we talked about like Law and Order and all of those types of things, because you had what some call the mean world syndrome, that you watch the things in the social media. You watch the things in this different media and everything, and this makes you think the world is actually bad than it is. So this relates to this distorting reality. Now, in that particular presentation, we also talked about how what was interesting was that some of the Law and Order stuff also became a means of educating people about rape myths and other issues like that. So I'm not saying media can't be used for good things. However, keep in mind that they were pushing the studies at that time. There's no telling what's all out there now. I'm not. I would have to go in and study all that stuff to look at that. But basically, a discussion, especially on her talk about this book on Ava Radio. She linked a lot of these things, and the announcer guy, what do you call him, interviewer, Al Krista, he was really interested in the whole Marcuse connection with Angela Davis and the Weather Underground, because that, you kind of have some terrorism type stuff going on there. And then they went into about cultural hegemony by Gramsci, and you'll hear a lot when critical race theory is brought up about Gramsci and this whole idea right there, and people will make connections with Obama and those things like that. She also talked about the internalized authoritarianism. She essentially said that what is good things like traditional values, faith, father role, and all that, these people called it internalized authoritarianism, that we internalize this oppression, we've accepted this oppression, and now we're perpetrating it. She talks about the F scale, which stands for fascist scale, this personality test that's in existence, and just this whole infiltration idea. One in that particular video, it also talked about how teachers are now being evaluated with AI based on their applications and stuff on their wokeness. So I thought that was interesting. So one thing that was kind of I've always wondered about is in 1995 there's a movie called The Panther, and it's about the Black Panther Party, and it's fictional. But if I remember right, there was a part in the movie where they wanted to promote their view of black rights and all of that stuff by their means. But then later on, they linked up with other people that were communists. And so what seems to be going on, at least the story that Noel's telling, is that you had people that were communists, Marxists, that were influencing, they were looking at the divides and the racism. They were looking for those opportunities to use that as a way to promote their cause, so there's that discussion there. I've already talked about the march across through the institutions, you know, where we're talking about academia, the academy, we're talking about the family, we're talking about personhood and all of that stuff. What's interesting is she laid out that she said that there's three main obstacles to revolution. There's private property, okay? There's the family and fatherhood, and then faith. And she basically argues that we get our idea of personhood from family and faith. So going into this whole conflict theory, basically, you know, the religion is the opium of the masses. Well, this is religion distracts you from doing anything about your suffering. So therefore, what happens is most people are just going through, you know, hard workers, going through life, depending on their religion to get through. But so what has to happen is the intellectual activists have to awaken them. And so the book goes into talking about Engels and Marx. Engels funded the Origin of the Family book that they wrote. And in that book, let's see, in that book, it basically talks about how the husband, the wife needs to escape the husband's oppression, join the workforce, and have more sexual freedom, and that children need to be raised by the community. And we can see how this plays out and all of that. So basically, the main idea of chapter 3 is this whole idea about how this Frankfurt School was studying why the revolution only happened with Lenin and only partially, and why didn't it happen in other places, and then it was transplanted to the Columbus University. Other things that are in the book, I really, you know, it's just more detail on those issues. But essentially, if you look at that structure that I went over, those main ideas, you could see, you know, for details, for illustration purposes, as I was saying, to orient someone that is not aware of some of these movements, that would be fine. Of course, you would have to tell a person this author is Catholic, and so where they're good at identifying the problem, they don't have the right solution into the details of how to deal with the woke movement and things like that. So yeah, so I just going to see how long this video took. But for those out there that are viewing this now, if you liked it, then like it. Share it with others. Hit the bell for notifications so that you don't miss out on additional content. Keep this ministry in prayer most of all. And if you feel God's blessed you through the ministry and you would like to donate, you can contribute through the PayPal link that's underneath the About section of the channel or underneath most videos. God bless.